the Department of Defense has a budget of $2 trillion. So it is one of the largest departments in the entire federal apparatus. It has about 950,000 military employees or civilian employees, I apologize. And then it has another 2 million military officers and soldiers that make up that entire department. So it's the largest as far as employment. It's not the largest as far as spending, because we've talked about the one that was the largest, including spending, because they have to pay for all of our debt payments. So it's still pretty big, though. It's made up of what folks kind of know as part of the department: Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and the newest addition, the Space Force. But it also includes other things, what are called defense agencies, that are more similar to what we've talked about with other departments where there are sub-agencies.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Hey everyone, welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fran. The national debt keeps climbing, and just like with personal finances, when you owe a lot, you start to make cuts to get things under control. Congress really should be doing the same to protect taxpayers. And that's where DOGE comes in, with a goal to cut $1 trillion in federal spending. But on this podcast, we asked, I wonder if we could double that. That's why we launched a series called Big Ideas for Smaller Government, where we talk about what could realistically be cut to reach $2 trillion in savings. Today, we're going to focus on the Department of Defense, or DoD, as we know it today. So how did we get the DoD? America's early military efforts were managed by separate departments: War, Navy, and each with their own leadership and priorities. But after World War II, it became clear that the United States needed a more unified approach to national security. So in 1947, under the National Security Act, the Department of Defense was created to bring all the military branches, Army, Navy, and the newly formed Air Force, under one umbrella. Over time, the DoD has grown into the largest government agency responsible for coordinating military strategy, protecting U.S. interests at home and abroad, and managing everything from high-tech defense systems to global troop deployments. So, now that we know what the DoD does, let's talk to our guest for this series, Jeremiah Mosteller, who's the Policy Director for Americans Prosperity, and our favorite guest, because he comes on so much, to talk about what cuts could be made at DoD. Jeremiah, welcome back.
Hey, David, so excited to be here with you again and to talk about one of the biggest, baddest departments in the federal government.
Absolutely. Before we get started, did you know that the Pentagon sits on land that was once partly owned by Confederate General Robert E. Lee? Interesting fun fact.
Wow. Yeah, you're bringing new facts to me today. I was not aware of that. I knew Arlington Cemetery, which is adjacent, was on his property because his house is still there. But that's good. That's interesting to know.
Yeah, fun. I have all kinds of fun facts for you. Well, all right. So to get started, I mean, DoD is mammoth. So can you first break down the DoD's budget for us?
Yeah. So, David, the Department of Defense has a budget of $2 trillion. So it is one of the largest departments in the entire federal apparatus. It has about 950,000 military employees or civilian employees, I apologize. And then it has another 2 million military officers and soldiers that make up that entire department. So it's the largest as far as employment. It is not the largest as far as spending, because we've talked about the one that was the largest, including spending, because they have to pay for all of our debt payments. So it's still pretty big, though. It's made up of what folks kind of know as part of the department: Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and the newest addition, the Space Force. But it also includes other things, what are called defense agencies, that are more similar to what we've talked about with other departments where there are sub-agencies. So the branches of the military are actually a little distinct from some of the other types of sub-agencies we've discussed in this series so far. But as far as sub-agencies, there's things that you would expect, such as the Defense Reconnaissance Office, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, But there's also more exciting things that I think your listeners would love to learn more about, like the Defense Contract Audit Agency and the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. So those are probably the most exciting. I'm sure everyone wants to hear about those.
Jeremiah, I'm sure that you are very excited by the audit agency.
I am. I know your listeners may not be as big a nerd as I am, though.
That's all right. I'm sure we got some accountants out there. So I heard a story about DoD spending $5 million on a new camouflage pattern. It kind of makes sense. I mean, we do want camouflage to be good, but what was the issue with it?
Yeah, so they spent, the Army specifically in this case, spent $5 million to develop what is called the Uniform Camouflage Pattern. And your listeners might recognize it if they saw any type of recent or even a few years ago camouflage that had Army logos on it. It's essentially a pixelated pattern, kind of looks like something you design and paint on your computer, and it includes gray, beige, and green. The problem with it, though, was that the way the pattern was developed, it actually made soldiers more visible to the naked eye in the Middle East through a very scientific thing that has to do with our eyes and the way the science works with the way we interpret colors, called isoluminance. And so it actually made them more visible, even though the goal was to make them less visible.
So we spent $5 million to make our soldiers less camouflaged.
That's right.
So I wish that wasn't a true story, but there's so many of those. So what did Congress do when they found out about this?
So Congress had been hearing from both former and current members of the Army about how they were concerned about this and how they could see their colleagues more readily, how threats against them could see their colleagues more readily. And so Congress actually included some appropriations language in a prior appropriations package. They required the Department of Defense to go back and redesign camo, not only for the Army, but for all the branches, specifically to build something out that works specifically for the Middle East, which was a newer area of combat for America. Though we've been there for decades now, at the time that this was happening, we were newer there. And so they actually forced them to do that. And so the DoD went back through this entire process and redid that. Though there still continued to be other problems, as I think we're going to talk about here in a minute.
So, I mean, it was bad enough that we wasted $5 million to make soldiers less camouflaged. But what did the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, find out before this happened?
Yes, I mean, they had been raising red flags for years, David, because of the fact that essentially the Department of Defense across the board had went from having two standard camouflage patterns, one for forest and one for other types of environments, that all of the branches of the military used. So Army, Marines, Navy, everyone used these two different patterns. But as this Army pattern was being developed, what most people didn't know is actually each branch was kind of developing its own set of patterns. And so we ended up with 7 different camouflage patterns across the 4 different branches that existed at that time. And it wasn't clear that there was actually a distinguishing factor between some of these. Some of them look very similar if you look at the samples that are in the GAO report. And the Government Accountability Office estimated that, hey, if DoD had just coordinated across these branches, it could have saved about $82 million in that development cost by just continuing that kind of prior policy of collaborating across branches, sharing knowledge, sharing technology, and not having duplication.
Yeah, you know, I think we could all pretty much agree. Like, we want our soldiers to be well taken care of. We want to have the best munitions and vehicles that anybody could have, because we want our defense to be a priority. You know, we expect our government to really provide for our national defense, but it's these kind of things where you just hear, it almost seems like when it comes to, you know, the Department of Defense or the military, there's like an added zero on, you know, that in waste. It's just unbelievable. And that comes at the expense of obviously the taxpayers, but our soldiers, you know, and this is money that's not going to help, you know, provide for our soldiers and provide for, you know, the best defense. There's another infuriating one to me, which regarding the Air Force, and you know that they thought they needed a certain type of coffee cup for their cargo planes. Can you explain that instance and what's with these cups?
Yeah, David. So these coffee cups cost about $1,300 a piece. And to be clear for listeners, these aren't just your standard ceramic mug or paper cup. These were actually a coffee cup that was used in these large bombers and tankers and cargo planes that the Air Force uses. And it actually plugged into the plane, allowed them to reheat their coffee, tea, and soup, even if they decided to bring soup along. But at $1,300 a pop, that was pretty expensive. And the reason why this came to light, actually, was some members of Congress learned that the plastic handle on these cups was actually faulty and so consistently broke. So rather than trying to fix that plastic handle, every time the handle broke, the Air Force would just throw that entire cup away and buy a new one at $1,300 a pop. And so it became a pretty scandalous thing. And I think it's actually a good example, like the prior example where Congress stepped in after hearing from people on the ground about the wasteful spending and said, hey, step up, figure this out. And so the Air Force has now kind of stepped in. They've fixed the problem. And they still cost $1,300 a piece, but they are now 3D printing the handles when they break, which is a much lower cost to do that internally than just throwing it away and purchasing a new one every single time.
Oh, that's incredible, man. I'm sorry. All right. So getting down the nitty gritty, like what are some of the ways that the Department of Defense could really save taxpayer money?
Yeah. Well, David, I mean, it's pretty plain and simple. The recommendation that we've been making and we've been talking about and that we've heard from folks in DOD and from former folks who work there was, hey, the DOD can save a lot of money by reducing contracting, because there are a lot of instances where they go to these private government or military contractors to get services completed, and they could actually do it more cheaply if they had full-time civilian or military employees complete those jobs. And we talked about similar instances of this, David, in prior episodes, where we talked about the Department of Veterans Affairs paying Deloitte, a high-priced contracting firm, to do a salary thing at $2 million, and they were able to find another company to do it at $50,000. So that's an example from another agency. But we're recommending that DOD take a look at all its books, all the things it hires contractors for, and just reduce by 15% the amount of contractors that it has and try and substitute those roles with some full-time employees. Of course, it will be less employees than the number of contracts, because usually an employee can do more than one of those contracts at a time. And we estimate that that'll save about $26 billion a year, or $260 billion over 10 years. So it's pretty substantial savings just by taking a look at these things, analyzing that what they're paying for actually makes sense, or if an employee can do it instead of a contractor.
So if we take that $260 billion over 10 years, or $26 billion over a year, and we add those to our cuts, our running total so far, what's our new total?
Yeah, I mean, David, we are so close. That brings us to $1,997.5 billion. So we literally can see the goal right now.
Oh, that's just some pocket change if you're talking billions to get to our goal. All right. Well, Jeremiah, as always, thanks so much for coming on. And, you're going to be coming on again a number of times still. People love having Jeremiah on. We get fan mail all the time just about Jeremiah. And we're going to have you on next time to talk about the General Services Administration and what we can cut from there. That is some fun.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, especially for those accounting and audit nerds out there. They're going to love this next episode.
Nice. Well, folks, if you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.